Okay, hello everyone, and good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. Thank you for joining us at the National Endowment for Financial Education for our webinar entitled Improving Measurement in the Study of Consumer Finance, Consensus from the NEFE Scale Validation Project. My name is Madeline Smith, Research Manager at NEFE, and we'll just start with a couple of housekeeping items. So all attendees will be on mute for the presentation. We will send a copy of both the slide deck and a recording of the webinar to all participants. And we will have a question and answer session near the end. And if you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Okay, so NEFE's mission is to champion effective financial education. We are the independent, centralizing voice providing leadership, research, and collaboration to advance financial well-being. NEFE envisions a nation where everyone has the knowledge, confidence, and opportunity to live their best financial life. We have four main research priorities: measurement, systemic inequality, data and methodological limitations, and youth-focused initiatives. While this project is squarely focused on the NEFE measurement priority, it also speaks to systemic inequality and data and methodological limitations. As a field, we need measures that authentically reveal differences across populations and do not add unnecessary bias in our studies. Our scale validation project, led by Dr. Dee Warmath and a team of esteemed researchers in our field, focuses on exactly that. And now it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Dee Warmath. Dee is a consumer scientist who served for over 5 years as a principal investigator for the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection on its project to define and measure financial well-being and test hypotheses of its drivers. She was also a principal investigator in the NCAA and Department of Defense Mind Matters Challenge, with a 3-year project examining the role of design thinking and social marketing in encouraging concussion reporting among young adults. Her research has been published in a variety of journals, including the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Consumer Affairs, British Journal of Sports Medicine, Journal of Business Research, Sports Health, and Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. And she has presented at a variety of international and national conferences. Dee is also a fellow of the Center for Financial Security at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an associate professor at UGA's College of Family and Consumer Sciences. I will now hand things over to Dee, where she will go into greater detail about this impactful project.
Thank you, Madeline. So I'm very happy to be here today and being the one selected to represent the team of people who worked on this project together. So my goal today, the way I guess I want you to think about what we're going to do, is this is almost like the trailer or the teaser of what's to come. So where it's a webinar and we're presenting what we've done, it's something that we hope generates conversation and leads to other things in the field. So in this webinar, we're going to share our experience with the NEFE Scale Validation Project and the outcome of that being a consensus statement on measurement. So we'll talk a little bit about the unique data collection that NEFE undertook and some of the analyses that we did to explore the data and to prompt discussion around the propositions that might go into that consensus statement. The outcome of our work was actually 19 propositions or statements about measurement in our field, and that field being consumer finance and financial education, that we feel need more thought, more conversation, more attention. And we've organized those 19 around 5 different domains. And this consensus statement, which isn't quite often done in our field, but is done in some of the other fields that I'm part of, is something that will be published in the not too distant future, we hope, in the Journal of Family and Economic Issues, along with several small projects that make use of the NEFE data and then follow through on the scale validation aspect of this particular project. And so what we're hoping coming out of this is that researchers, both academic, non-academic, established students, practitioners who use measurement with their clients in various ways, policymakers, journal editors, reviewers, funders, that all of the groups that have anything to do with this field are really thinking more intently and more precisely about how are we measuring things and what are the implications of those measures for the statements that we make. And like Madeline said, how do these measures help us understand different consumer groups, and are they the right measures for the consumer groups that we are studying or that we're working with? So in this webinar, we'll highlight the process, we'll highlight the 5 domains, and then we encourage you to read those papers when they come out. And I will say up front that NEFE has actually arranged for those to be open access articles, so that way everyone can get access to them. So some takeaways for today. So if you're a researcher, we hope that this webinar will help you consider measure validity rather than popularity in the selection of measures for a study. So quite often in our field, we look to see what is everybody else doing, rather than looking to see what measure is the right measure for what I have planned to do. So we hope that we give you permission and direction and guidance to make that measure validity be central in your selection. And then we also hope that you'll consider how you can discuss limitations of the available measures and implications for the interpretation of results. There's likely not anything like a perfect measure in our field. So they all have some limitations, and we have to recognize those as we do our work and as we interpret what those implications are for practice. And practitioners and policymakers, we hope that this webinar helps you, encourages you to examine the measures that were used before accepting study results. Think about how things were done and not just what was found. And then consider whether the measures are valid for your population of interest. Is this something that you should be using with your clients or with your constituents? And then for journal editors, reviewers, and funders, we hope that this encourages you to create incentives for the study of measurement. It is very difficult to do a pure measurement paper, especially in our field, and have that be published. It takes a lot of time. It's very costly. And so how might we create some opportunities for more of this type of work to be done? And then also to encourage you to evaluate measurement decisions that were made as an input to your decision about what to publish and what to fund. So before I go any further, I do want to introduce the people who were on the panel, and we all worked together as we put together this consensus statement and did the small projects. And so we have Katrina from Boston College. So Katrina was our PhD candidate who was with us, and Ashley from Brigham Young University, Gary from FINRA, Miranda from Texas Tech University, Kurt from the University of Puerto Rico, and then of course we had our fearless leader from NEFE, Joshua, who was the one who asked all the great questions and kept pushing us to think about things in ways that would make them be very actionable in the field for a variety of audiences. So throughout this presentation, we're going to have a couple of poll questions to get you involved in the conversation. And then again, at the end, we'll have some opportunities for you to ask us questions. But our first poll question for you is, in your work, do you develop new measures, use existing measures, both or neither? Just to give us a little bit of a sense of who's here today and maybe what your connection is with measurement and what role you play in that. So we'll give everybody just a few more seconds to answer the question. All right. And then, of course, we all hate to take poll questions and not see the results. And so, oh, we have 47% of the participants develop new measures and use existing measures. So that's terrific. We have 14% who to do neither. And then we have the 28% who use existing measures. And then the 11% develop new. So I hope that in today's webinar that each of you find something that's useful for the ways in which you interact with measurement. All right, so before we go any further, I'd like to just sort of orient us to the types of measures that we are going to be focused on today. So we are focused on measures that are relevant to consumer finance and financial education that reflect the human decision maker. So their perceptions, experiences, assessments, and attitudes. And so we're going to be focusing on things that you might call a more subjective scale, more psychological scale, more reflective scale. So we're not considering the more objective, cold, hard facts that can be gathered without involving the consumer. So our goal in this study, and NEFE's goal in this study, was to ensure that we had valid, reliable measures that capture what it is that drives that human decision maker. So everything from their propensity to plan as opposed to their actual planning attitudes, and financial well-being as opposed to objective financial situation are some of the things that we're going to be considering as we go through. And these are the things that are most often impacted by your experiences in life, by where you've come from and how you view the world. And a lot of the scales, not all of them, but there are a number of scales that were developed with a particular population, maybe students at a university. And maybe those students were obviously of a certain age, a certain racial or ethnic makeup. Maybe they tended to be a higher proportion female than male. And so how does that psychological scale that was created then apply to people who had different experiences in life and might interpret things differently? And in our field, quite often that work is not being done. So that was another reason for really focusing in more on this type of measurement, this type of scale. And I remember the first time that I was approached about the study was at the CFP academic conference. And Jill, who was at NEFE at the time, approached me because I was presenting a poster about the financial literacy scale that David Zimmerman and I developed and published in the Journal of Consumer Affairs. And she asked me about our interest in measurement and how we got there and what we were thinking about measurement in the field more broadly. So it's very interesting to have that conversation with someone in terms of, just the beginning of this recognition that we need to really think about measurement more broadly and not just continue with the measures that we have that really may or may not be valid, may or may not be reliable, may or may not be accepted, and how that's hampering our ability to advance knowledge, action, and theory to improve consumer, household, and community outcomes. And so that was the conversation back then in terms of some of the early thinking about why NEFE might want to get into this measurement work. And also the recognition there was very, very little work that it was done to assess whether current scales support those comparisons of subgroups. And so really doing the work to look at genders, races, ages, and other characteristics. And so that was the background of this particular study. So when NEFE set out for the Scale Validation Project, their goal was to identify impactful and feasible recommendations for the improvement of measure-related decisions in the field, and to demonstrate the work that should be undertaken in scale development, validation, selection, and justification. So there was a lot of work done early on in this project that's been going on now for several years, where it was conversations with a panel of experts, with others, talking about what work should happen, what are some of the things that should be undertaken, and that we should be we should see coming out in our field, and what is it that perhaps is preventing that from happening. And a lot of those early conversations really shaped the NEFE project and what NEFE set out to do in this particular project. So the project approach then was, first of all, to develop the survey. So identifying the scales, what demographics or subgroups were going to be studied, any covariates that were needed, and then to go in and to actually field the study. And I'll tell you that was a very difficult process, right? There are a lot of scales out there to be considered. And even for a given topic, like for example, money management behavior, there are multiple scales that exist. And so there were some tough choices that NEFE had to make about which scales to include and what criteria to use in that process. So there, I'm sure, are a lot of opinions about whether the optimal scales were identified and used in this particular study. But I think the most important thing to think of is that this was a project really to demonstrate the work that needs to be done by an entire field, not by a single project. And then the other thing that was done was that NEFE set some pretty intentional quotas around those different demographic groups to provide sufficient data, for example, on different genders or races and ethnicities, even the primary language spoken in the home, living arrangements, as we'll see a little bit later, to make sure that we had enough data to be able to do the analysis. And then after the survey was fielded, the data was collected. Then the second phase of the project was the analysis phase. And here we applied confirmatory factor analysis and measurement and variance methods to the data. And again, our goal there was not to make definitive statements about particular scales. Our goal was to generate conversation among the panel of experts about what are we seeing, what do we think this means, and what is it that we do about it. The third was the consensus process. And here we follow the example of Emily Crotius and others who've applied this Delphi method to identify recommendations. And we followed their lead and their example to come to the consensus. And we'll talk more about that process in a minute. And then the part of the project that we're in right now is the small projects. And so this is where subgroups of the panel of experts have come together to apply some of the methods to focus scale questions. So the NEFE data that was collected, there were a total of 993 surveys that were completed. And you can see here the ages 18 up to 65 and older. Incomes, so a nice range from less than 25,000 to 100,000 or more. And then you can see for sex and gender that we had males at 29, females at 66 in terms of the sex assigned at birth, and then 57% woman, 24% man, and 14% from one of the additional genders. And here are the scales that were included in the study. So the brief money management scale, the domain-specific risk-taking scale, executive personal finance, financial decision-making ability and financial self-efficacy, the financial skill scale from the CFPB, the financial well-being with the expected future financial security and current money management stress from Nedemeyer et al., personal savings orientation from Delakia et al., propensity to overspend on credit cards, and propensity to plan for money long-term. And so these just happen to be the ones that were included in this particular NEFE study. And obviously, I'm sure everyone who's on the webinar or listening to this webinar later can think of other scales where you're like, oh, I wish they'd use this instead of that, or I wish this had been included in the study. So again, just a demonstration and a way of getting started on this process. So a couple of things that guided us. We did spend quite a bit of time looking back at some of the literature on scales and scale development. I just pulled two of the quotes out here. First, a scale should be consistent with the researcher's understanding of the nature of the latent construct being measured. So it's important that we have this understanding of the construct first, and then we go forward to develop our scale. But then once we have the scale, it should reflect then the construct that was intended to be measured. And then the second quote there, a scale should reveal differences among individuals if those individuals actually differ on that attribute. And so that's where we get into the measurement and variance, and we start to think about, is this scale, are the differences that we're seeing just, do they mean anything? Or do they reflect real differences in the particular construct or attribute that we're trying to measure? So those are the two things that we were focused on. And so with the scale confirmation, we looked at whether the hypothesized relationship between the items and the underlying latent construct fits the new data. So that was our confirmatory factor analysis. And second, whether there's evidence that the scale would perform consistently over repeated applications or conditions. And so really looking at reliability as internal consistency. And so with those results, we separated the 10 scales into categories called good, reasonable, and problematic, might need further attention. We really debated a lot about what is it that we could say from a single study about a scale. And I think we were all in agreement that there was nothing that was definitive that we could say. That the only thing that we could do is report the results that we saw in this particular data set and this particular analysis, and then to encourage others maybe to take those scales and to look at them again. So good was evidence of good fit between the hypothesized factor structure and data, factor loadings above the threshold, reliability statistics above the threshold. Reasonable, there was reasonable fit in the CFA. Most factor loadings were above the threshold, and reliability statistics were again above the threshold. Problematic was fair to poor fit in the CFA, and or multiple factor loadings below the threshold, and or reliability statistics below the threshold. We actually didn't find any very clear direction in the literature that would help guide us in this. And so this is what we came up with. So if anyone who is on the webinar today has any thoughts or any direction that you could provide us in terms of where to go and where you might have seen something like this, we would love to have your input. So here are the results. So There were several scales: brief money management scale, financial decision-making ability, self-efficacy, the financial well-being, and the propensity to plan for money long-term, that all fell into the good bucket. There were 3 that were in the reasonable bucket, so domain-specific risk-taking, personal savings orientation, and propensity to overspend on credit cards. And then problematic were the executive personal finance scale and the financial skill scale. So the second thing that we did was to take a look at the measurement and variance. So here we're asking whether the measurement properties of a scale are consistent across subgroups of customers. I don't know what it says, customers, of people, consumers. First, does the factor structure hold? And so this is the configural. Second, do the factor items load consistently on the factors? This is the metric. And third, do consumers with the same factor scores have similar averages on the item, which is the scalar? And again, because of the way that NEFE did their quotas and really concentrated on consumer characteristics to enable this work, we actually had many different consumer characteristics that we could analyze. Age, income, education, sex at birth, gender, relationship status, children, welfare, living arrangement, employment status, race, ethnicity, and primary language. And I won't read all of these, but within that, we had quite a few groups that we were able to examine that had sufficient data to support the analyses that were being done. And so the measurement and variance work on the configural, metric, and scalar was done for each of these consumer characteristics. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. The propensity to plan for money long-term. So our conclusion about this scale, it seems to be a valid and reliable measure overall. Caution should be applied when comparing living arrangements or primary language spoken at home. And so exploring differences by living arrangement and primary language might reveal some interesting findings related to financial planning under these circumstances. And so we thought additional work could be done if anyone were interested in examining those 2 characteristics and differences across circumstances. Personal savings orientation, so evidence of reasonable fit, reliability metrics above the threshold, factor loadings were above the threshold, except for 1 item. I like to discuss the topic of saving money with my family and friends. But here, only sex at birth and genders showed measurement and variance. And so some observations, so that 1 item was problematic for the scale overall and for many of the groups considered in measurement and variance testing. And researchers wanted to compare demographic groups, except for sex or gender, should recognize the differences observed might be due to measurement bias rather than meaningful differences. And research is needed to understand how personal savings orientation as a construct differs across consumer groups. All right, with all of that, I'll get to our second poll question. So did you receive any training related to measurement, development, validation, or selection when you were a student? And so yes, no, or I don't remember. And so we're curious here to understand how much of this is actually happening in grad school. And perhaps it's something that that we need to encourage maybe conference organizers. Or is there an opportunity for short courses that that might be available to help provide some of this training to different people? So if you want to take just a minute and yes, no, and I don't remember. All right, I think we have our results. So 51% said no, that no training was given for measurement, development, validation, or selection when you were a student. It's one of the things that we talked about a lot in terms of how graduate school might be one of the places where we can begin to introduce this conversation and even perhaps use the consensus paper as a way of prompting that conversation. It is good to see 34% did receive some of that training. So now let's talk about how we moved from here to consensus. So again, a lot of that analysis and work was done, and we've spared you most of the details here today, but some of that will be coming out in the small projects that are to be published. but we reviewed a lot of different details in the work that we had done. And our goal in that was to begin to identify and inspire things that we thought maybe needed to be some of the propositions that we put forward that that could generate this conversation elsewhere and turn this into something that is happening across our field and not just in one project or in one Zoom meeting. So to get to the consensus method, the consensus statement, what we used was the Delphi method. And so as you can see here at the bottom, the Delphi method provides an iterative, collaborative, efficient, and unbiased approach to identifying collective opinions of experts. And so there are several great examples that Emily Crocius at the University of Washington has done recently with applying this method. And again, we followed her lead in that process. So the first step, 3A there, is generation. And so we did this process using a Google Sheet, and everyone was able to go in at their leisure. It wasn't a conversation to develop them, and everyone could just note down as many different items as they thought, not worrying about whether they were repetitive or anything. And then we took those and looked at the recommendations and consolidated some of the ones that were the same. And we came away with a total of 32 candidate recommendations that were generated independently. Then we had a panel of experts meeting, and we went through the 32, and we discussed each of them, what was meant by them, and really gave everybody a chance to talk about what they hoped each one represented. It also gave us an opportunity to talk about some of the barriers and limitations to some of the recommendations that were being made. And then we went into the round one voting. And so here, each recommendation was rated based on impact and feasibility using a Qualtrics survey. So again, each expert was allowed to think about this on their own. And then we came back in our next meeting where now we had the results of the voting, and we had 19 of the 32 items that were more highly rated, that were above the threshold that we had set. And then the conversation in that meeting was first and foremost about the 13 items that didn't make the cut, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't leaving anything behind that anybody on the panel felt was important for us to include. And there was actually an item that we decided to put back, two of them actually, that we decided to put back into the conversation and the round two voting. And then in the round two voting, we actually came away with 19 items, although interestingly, it's not the exact same 19 items that we had in round one. And then we started to talk about how these 19 items sort of fit together and what they might represent in terms of different domains. So the domains that we came away with were first establishing criteria for measurement, development, selection, and evaluation. Can there be best practices that we have in our field? Can there be things where we look to the experts in measurement? We also think about where we are as a field today, and can we develop some things that are very realistic and yet take us into a much better place in terms of the measurement that we develop and use. And so everything from these minimum criteria to guidelines to different practices. And that might help a researcher in the study design. Maybe people are using the most frequently used measure because they are one of the ones who didn't receive the training in grad school, and that seems like a reasonable alternative. So are there ways that we could communicate other ways of designing the study and selecting the measures? Can we give examples or can we give guidance in terms of how to interpret results in light of the measures that are used there? So what are some of the limitations around the comparison of the groups that you had, or whether or not these measures are likely to be accurate in the setting that you're studying? And then also expectations for the use of measures in limitations, and then the recognition of the measures used in the implications. The second domain that we came away with, and this one has, the first one has 3 statements, this one has 3 statements as well. So this one is about providing incentives for consideration of measurement topics and issues. And here it's really targeting journal article types and funding. And so everything from, should journal editors consider adding measurement topics as a type of paper that could be published in particular journals, not to give away too many of the things that we hope you'll read in the consensus paper. But again, measurement takes a long time. It's very difficult to get published. Most people don't publish it. Reviewers, when they review it, tend to think that it's an unfinished paper. And so now you need to do something else with the measurement. So all the work that you did to develop the measurement isn't sufficient for the publication. So are there incentives both from encouraging publication, but also funding projects that really want to consider measurement topics and issues? And it might be that it's measurement topics and issues within a broader project, but it could also be projects where that is the focus. Domain 3 has 5 different statements and propositions related to offering training and measurement. And so this is everything from graduate programs and how do we make sure that students going forward have this opportunity to have training and measurement, both development, but also selection and application of those measures. But then let's not stop at graduate programs. What about conferences? What about the 51% who didn't receive this type of training while a student? And there are new things that are being developed, new methods, and the evolution of measurement in our own field. And we hope more of that with this particular consensus statement. How can those be topics of conversation at conferences and other venues? And then domain 4. And so here it's really about supporting researchers in measure selection. And so the targets here are the field, but they're also the association. We looked at a few other domains where there are actually websites set up where you can go in and answer a few quiz questions about the study that you're planning. And there will actually be recommendations made for the measures that you use under those settings. I think that we're not very close to that right now as a field. I could be wrong, and anybody who disagrees, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we're closer than I think. But I think that that isn't a bad goal for us to have in terms of having different tools and options to help people decide which measure is right for them. And then in domain 5, it's really just in general elevating the role of measurement topics and issues. And here we had 5 different statements, journal editors, funders, reviewers, but also just the field in general. And how do we encourage more conversation about the state of measurement in our field in various forums? And so that was the 5th domain. And so I really hope that you'll go and read the consensus statement paper when it comes out. Again, the goal of this consensus statement is to spark a conversation regarding measurement. And these measures, again, are the ones that come from the perspective of that human decision maker, the consumer. And so we hope that those conversations will elevate the importance of measurement, will prepare researchers for the development and selection of valid, reliable, and culturally responsive measures, and provide resources and incentives to encourage responsible behaviors in study design and interpretation, and also more research on measurement and on the development of measures themselves. So with that, we'll go to our next poll question. So how comfortable are you in assessing the effect of the measures used on the interpretation of a given study? So we have a scale here from very comfortable to not at all comfortable, and then we give you the option of not sure, I've never thought about it. And so how well equipped do you feel you are to take a look at a particular study? It could be your own study that you've been conducting, or it could be reading someone else's study, and then to decide based on the measures that they used in the study, how appropriate is the interpretation and the implications that are given for that particular study. Is that something that you feel comfortable doing, or is that something where you kind of defer to the person who did the study and assume that they selected the best measures and considered everything needed to be considered? So we'll see what our answers are here in just a minute. So we have 47% is somewhat comfortable. So I think that's great. We have 12% in that in the very comfortable, and then 15% who really haven't thought about it in the past. So I think that that it's good that we have that, what is that, 59% who were in the somewhat and very comfortable. Be wonderful to see those percentages flipped in the future, as we all perhaps have more conversations about it. And that's where I also think that having those minimum criteria can be very helpful, right? When we know what's expected and we've come together as a field and said, this is our minimum and where we'd like to land, then I think that we can all look at this and say, I do feel more comfortable in doing that evaluation. All right, and one final thing that I wanted to share was just about the projects. So when you do go out to the Journal of Family and Economic Issues and the special issue that will be coming out later to take a look at the consensus statement, you'll also find several small project papers that were conducted using the NEFE data to share more of the work that was done as a lead up to the consensus statement with the academic community and with others. And also demonstrates the type of work that we believe would be useful in advancing our field. And again, these are very short 4,500 word papers that are focused entirely on measurement. And these could be sort of ingredients of a larger paper in the future, or perhaps they could be a standalone article type in some journals in the future as well. So we'll encourage you to go and take a look at those when that special issue comes out. So returning to our takeaways, let give you a chance to see how well we did. So like I said, this is really more of the trailer or the teaser of the full paper that we hope that you'll read. But hopefully those of you who have attended and watched this webinar, that you will be more likely to consider measure validity and selection of measures. Take an extra minute to go and look at how was that measure developed, what work has been done on that measure since its development. And then also to think about in your own work, how do you discuss the limitations of available measures and how do you interpret your results in light of the measures that you had available to you right now? Practitioners, hope that you'll take a look at the measures that you're using with your clients and ask a few questions about how was this developed? What population was used to develop this measure? How does that compare to the people who are my clients today? Is there any evidence to say that this is a valid measure for my clients? And then policymakers as well, taking a look at the measures before accepting the study results to guide a policy recommendation or decision. Journal editors, reviewers, and funders really hope that this encourages you to think about the role that you might play in encouraging the study of measurement, in motivating especially young scholars who have that tenure clock in front of them to devote time to studying measurement. But really everyone, whether they're academic or not, and whether they're early career or not, what are the ways in which we can incentivize more of this conversation in our field? Because it is our collective belief, the panel of experts and NEFEs, that if we can bring more attention to the measures that are being used, we can learn more from the body of work that's being conducted, and we can make sure that that work is adequately representing the different consumer subgroups that should be considered. And with that, we'll get to our final poll question. And so we're very interested in hearing what you think would have the greatest effect on the attention paid to measurement in our field. So is it more training in measurement, more opportunities to publish measurement papers, clear expectations for measurement development and selection that can help not only the person doing the work, but also then the people who are using that research, more funding to address measurement, or something that's not on the list? So tough choice, because we're only giving you one option, and there might be more than one on this list that you think are important to do. But just let us know what today you think would have the greatest effect. We'll give you just a few more seconds, and then we'll show the percentages. All right, so it's pretty split across them, which says that we probably have a lot of work to do, a lot of things to be addressed. So number one there by just a nose is more training on measurement. And then we have a tie for second with clearer expectations and more funding, and then more opportunities to publish at the 13% and something else at the 13%. I wish the Zoom poll questions would let you write into something else, but maybe we can get to those in the chat or later, or in some of the conversations that we get to have around some of the consensus propositions at upcoming gatherings or conferences. So with that, we'll move on to our announcements and questions from the audience. So remember, I'll turn it back over to Madeline. Remember, you can use the chat function to submit your Q&A.
Thank you, Dee, for the incredibly insightful presentation, and thank you all for joining us today. So before we get into the Q&A, we just have one short announcement. So presentations and sessions like this will be a feature at our upcoming Financial Education, Innovation, and Impact Summit, which will be held October 8th through 10th in Denver. To learn more and register, you can use this QR code on the screen or go to financialeducationsummit.com, and registration ends on August 30th. We'll now move into the Q&A session. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions thus far, and you all can continue to submit questions using the Q&A box. Our first question is, what type of opportunities exist to help with the basics of measurement validation?
Don't know why I muted myself, Madeline. I should have done that. Sorry, can you say the question one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. It's what type of opportunities exist to help with the basics of measurement validation?
Well, so I think that the basics part of it leads me to think about how do you find different opportunities for education, right? There's some great books. There's one by DeVellis and Susan Thorpe that provides a great overview of sort of the basics of measurement and validation. If you're on a university campus or near one where you might be able to audit, then I would say that maybe look into what classes are available. And then, there are actually a lot of really interesting YouTube videos in this day and age. We learn a lot from YouTube. And so I think that there are a lot of good resources on YouTube as well. And so I would encourage you to perhaps combine some of those methods. So I think the DeVellis and Thorpe book on scale development is a tremendous resource. And I think that what that does is it gives you a nice grounding in, DeVellis is one of the godfathers of measurement. And so grounding in someone who really is an expert like that, and then perhaps pursuing some YouTube videos that might provide some additional insight would be a nice combination, I think, if I were just trying to get started in the basics of measurement.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Our next question is, did any items from the scales load better onto different scales that you considered than the scale that the item itself was a part of? They're wondering mostly about the conceptual distinctions and possible construct proliferation between some of these. For example, they would expect the money management scale and savings orientation scale to overlap heavily.
Yeah, so they, so that, I think that's a great question. And that was not a primary focus of the work that we did. Although we did take a look at some of those. I can tell you that particular example that was called out on the savings orientation and the money management behavior, that there was not really any overlap in those two scales, that those did hold up very nicely as two separate and distinct scales. It was really only that the personal savings orientation did not have the measurement and variance across most of the characteristics that we considered, and that was where that scale sort of fell apart. But it definitely was distinct from the money management behavior scale that includes far more than savings and is much more focused on the behavior than it is on the orientation.
Thank you. Also, I should have mentioned this at the very beginning. If any of the other expert panel members would like to help answer any of these questions, feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom function, and we will allow you to unmute. So the next question is, how did you order the questions asked of the participants? Were they grouped according to topic or the original scale, for example?
Yeah, we kept them in their original scale. And so each question was put into the survey as it would normally be entered into a particular survey. And the one thing that there was some randomization in terms of the order of presentation of the items in that as well. But it wasn't like we just put all of the items from all the different scales into one big question.
Awesome, thank you. I do see Joyce has her hand raised. And I believe I can ask her to unmute.
Okay, I wanted to just comment on how important I think this work is. I mean, just the fact we're having this conversation is a great stepping stone. I also think that the questions that people have are probably buried. I mean, this is we're bringing up a very important and a very complex topic. And I'm wondering if there'll be an opportunity after the fact to start some sort of I don't know, an ongoing dialogue, so that as people think of questions, is there a way to capture those questions and to keep the momentum? Well, you've started something. How do we keep it going?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Joyce. And I totally agree with you in terms of the importance of this, especially for our field. And I also agree with you in terms of, the question about how do we keep the conversation going. And I think, I think our hope is that these conversations will happen organically in different settings. But the challenge with that is that how do you then take each of those little organic sessions and allow them to become part of a larger conversation with a lot of cross-pollination across that? And I think that your question is actually a terrific challenge for the panel of experts and for NEFE to think about, how are we going to organize future opportunities for people, after they have time to think about the webinar, after they have time to read the consensus statement and maybe some of the small project papers. How and where do we allow those conversations to continue happening? Is there an opportunity to sponsor a breakfast or a table at breakfast at a particular conference for people who'd like to come and talk about measurement issues? I know that Joshua and I've spoken about the possibility of, presenting this work maybe in more detail after the publication comes out at different conferences and trying to promote conversations that way. But I welcome, and I'm sure NEFE welcomes any idea for how we go about continuing to motivate the conversation and then to harness that conversation to where it can be then directed to meaningful change in the field.
Yeah, those are all really good points. Thank you, Joyce, for chiming in, and you as well, Dee. Sorry, my screen is going ballistic. Our next question is we asked that question. My bad. Sorry. Is there research showing the effectiveness of financial education? And if so, what were the criteria used to measure efficacy, specifically in K-12?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that question is that that was not the focus of this research. So the focus of this research was measurement, right? We weren't looking at efficacy of a program. It wasn't an evaluation. Our hope is that, so there's nothing in this the study that could speak to that question. But our hope is that in the future, when that question gets asked, that there will be answers that are given with a recognition of the effect of the measurement. So I think the beauty of that question is that it's a great example of the questions that should be able to be answered in the future more specifically when this conversation and this work that we're hoping to promote happens.
Awesome, thank you. A lot of people are asking for the book you mentioned, and I see Katrina was kind enough to drop a link to it. So I may call on Joshua to add that into the chat for everyone who is asking about the book on measurement that you were talking about.
Okay. Yeah, so it's Develis and Scale Development. Thank you, Katrina, for putting that that link out there for everyone.
Awesome. It is now in the chat for everyone to see. Great. Our next question is, what was your favorite part of this work and maybe the most surprising finding or takeaway from the analyses of these surveys?
I would say, well, I'll tell you, the panel of experts conversations were by far my favorite. The fact that we had the luxury of spending time together to talk about nothing other than how do we measure certain constructs and and debating the approach and the findings and what does this mean and what do we do about it. That's something that, when do you ever get to do that, right? Outside of this NEFE project. So I would definitely say that was my favorite. The first thought that came to my mind was that ability to kind of wallow in data and measurement for a time period. Quite often in your work, you're like, okay, so let's get the data clean, let's get the measures developed, and let's start to run our models and go forward with that. And the fact that this project gave us permission, and in fact required us to stop and spend time on nothing more than measures, was again a luxury that we just don't seem to have very often in the work that we do. And so I thought that was a wonderful part about this project as well. It was really it was interesting to see the results of the scales, both the confirmatory analysis, but also the measurement and variance results. And so every time we ran something, it was kind of like, okay, you can do it. For each scale, we were like rooting for the scale to like pass all the hurdles and all the thresholds that were in there. And then you would see, okay, so it didn't pass this one. And then going back in and trying to investigate why. I think one of the most challenging things about this project, having 10 scales and 12 different consumer characteristics, was having this very strong desire to dig into and to do the Sherlock Holmes work of, okay, so what is problematic about the scale? How might the scale be improved? And seeing things that seemed like they would be very simple fixes, but knowing that in this project, we didn't have the time to go in and to do that. And seeing other scales where you're like, wow, this scale probably needs to go back to the let's understand this construct and start over. And knowing that this work kind of had to go across the surface of the 10 by 12 matrix that we were working in. And we were going to have to leave that other work for other people to take on.
Yeah, for sure. As somebody who definitely read your entire work and also summarized it a little bit for the NEFE website, the findings in general were so interesting and definitely surprised me. So I'm sure being on the front lines and being the ones actually doing the work was really, really fun. So a little jealous. So since the project is wrapped, what are some other surveys in the field that you might have wished you would have included?
Oh, there are a lot. So I think the interesting one for me was that NEFE selected the brief money management scale for the money management behavior. There's also the Do and Zao scale. I think that it would have been really interesting if there wasn't such a thing as respondent fatigue to ask both of those and to see sort of like, do they do different things? Are they basically the same scale? I think that would have been good. The other one that would have been really interesting that wasn't included in the study is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's financial well-being scale. That one was not included primarily because it's very highly correlated with current money management stress and not very correlated at all with expected future financial security. So the Nettemeyer scale was selected because it had both the current and the future dimension represented. And so that was why that decision was made. And there are so many others that I think could have been included in the study.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all the work you've done only shows that there's a lot of work to be done with all of these scales in our field. And I really wish you all had the capacity to repeat your project for every scale that we have in the field.
Yeah.
But
Well, but
you've
that's
made
where
amazing. Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Sorry, that's where I think that, really thinking about the work that was done here, not as the definitive statement, but as kind of a demonstration, right? The goal is to give permission to create space for this type of work to be done by everybody in the field. There's not a panel of experts who can sit down and do this in isolation and then just to say, here, use this, right? This has to be work that everyone who's working in the space recognizes, does, uses, so that as a field, we can improve the measurement that we have.
Yes, absolutely. As a final little more of a note than a question, our CEO, Dr. Billy Hensley, has dropped a comment in the Q&A and says that the fact we're having this discussion at all shows how much the research agenda in this field has progressed and matured over the last couple of decades. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we're very excited to see the papers published.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with that statement. I think that that this does reflect that this field has reached a certain point, that we can even have conversations about the measurement that has developed, and to take a look at the stock of things that we have, and to ask the question about, what do we want to take with us into the future, both in terms of measures, but also in terms of our practices around the measures that we develop and use.
Yes, absolutely. I think that wraps up all of our questions. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions. If we didn't get to your specific question, we will be happy to follow up via email. As a reminder, we will be sending a recording of this webinar to everyone who is registered, as well as a copy of the slides. And lastly, you can visit NEFE.org to learn about all the work we are doing in research in other areas, as well as to subscribe to our newsletter. You can also find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Medium, and Instagram. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day.